In a mountain village where the rice fields stretched as far as the eye could follow, a young man named Taeyang grew up admired by everyone who had ever seen his face, and he never once let them forget it. He spent his days in front of a polished bronze mirror while his father worked the harvest alone. He mocked the quiet ambitions of every man around him. And then, at the village festival, he said the wrong words to the wrong woman, and woke up the next morning as a stranger to his own reflection. What happened between that morning and the day he signed his first billion-dollar deal is a story nobody saw coming. Stay with me. My name is Taeyang. I grew up in a village pressed between two mountains, where the mornings smelled of pine resin and fresh earth, and my mother Jazin's cooking reached me before I even opened my eyes. My father Jimin was a rice farmer, a quiet, patient man whose hands were always rough and whose back was always slightly bent from the kind of work that never truly ends. We were not wealthy, but we were not without dignity. I was their only son, and from the moment I was old enough to understand what people meant when they stopped to stare, I knew I had been given something unusual. My face, people said, was the kind that belonged in a painting rather than a paddy field. Strangers mentioned it the way they mentioned the weather, as a simple, observable fact. Teachers let me off lightly. Girls brought food to my door without being asked. Even the village elders smiled at me with a softness they did not offer everyone. I accepted all of it as my natural inheritance. I did not question it. I did not feel grateful for it. I assumed the world had assessed me correctly and arranged itself accordingly. So while my father rose before dawn to tend the fields, I rose to tend my reflection. While my peers learned trades, I learned angles. While other young men were building something, I was polishing something. The same bronze surface, the same careful ritual, every single morning. I was 23 years old, the most admired face in the village, and I had never once built anything that would last beyond the moment someone stopped looking at me. That, I would soon discover, was not a gift. It was a debt. And the morning of the autumn festival was the morning it finally came due. I was not born handsome the way some men are, gradually, awkwardly, the features arranging themselves into something acceptable over time. I arrived that way. My mother Jazin told me the story so many times it became part of how I understood myself, that the midwife who delivered me paused before handing me to her, just for a moment, just to look. The women gathered outside our door that morning asked to see me, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity, because word had already traveled the length of the village in the time it took my father to walk from the birthing room to the well. Jimin never spoke much about my appearance. That was not his way. He was a man who expressed things through presence rather than words. Through the extra portion he placed in my bowl without being asked. Through the way he walked slightly ahead of me on market days, clearing a path without making it obvious he was doing so. His pride in me was quiet and total, and entirely unconditional. It was, I understand now, the most generous thing anyone has ever offered me. And I received it the way the vain receive everything, as confirmation rather than a gift. Our village sat in the crease between two mountains that turned purple at dusk and silver before dawn. The rice fields began where our compound ended and stretched outward in every direction, interrupted only by the river that ran cold and fast through the eastern edge, and by the old cedar tree at the village center where the elders gathered each evening to talk and argue and remember. It was the kind of place that asked nothing grand of its people, only that they work honestly, greet their neighbors, and remember where they came from. I loved it in those early years. I loved the smell of rain on the paddies and the sound of my mother's voice carrying through the house before sunrise. I loved the festivals, the lanterns, the communal meals where every family brought something and nobody left hungry. I was a warm child before I became a vain one. Quick to laugh, easy with strangers, genuinely curious about people in a way that made them feel seen. That version of me was real. I want to be clear about that, because it would be simpler to say the pride was always there, always waiting. But it was not. It grew. It was fed by every compliment accepted without gratitude, by every door that opened before I knocked, by every consequence that quietly rerouted itself around my face before I ever had to meet it. I was 10 years old the first time I understood that my appearance was a kind of power. And I was perhaps 12 when I began, without realizing it, to mistake that power for character. By the time I was 23, the warm boy my mother remembered had been almost entirely replaced by his own reflection. Almost, but not quite. That small remainder was the only thing that saved me. The mirror came first. Before breakfast, before prayer, before a single word to anyone in the house, the mirror came first. It was a circle of polished bronze, no larger than 2 open palms pressed together, hanging on the post beside my sleeping mat. My father had traded 3 weeks of surplus rice for it at the Eastern market when I was 16, because I had asked for it with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no about anything that concerned his appearance. Jimin carried it home without complaint, hung it carefully at the exact height I specified, and never once suggested that 3 weeks of rice was perhaps too high a price for a boy to see his own face. I repaid that generosity by spending the first hour of every morning in front of it. The ritual was precise. I oiled my hair with an extract pressed from camellia seeds, working it through from root to tip with my fingers until every strand fell as I wanted. I studied my jaw from both sides. I practiced expressions, not out of insecurity, but out of the particular vanity of someone who knows they are being watched and wants to control exactly what the watching produces. When I was satisfied, I dressed slowly, choosing the color of my robe the way a painter chooses a brushstroke, deliberately, with full awareness of effect. By the time I emerged each morning, Jimin had already been in the fields for 2 hours. He never said anything directly. That was not his nature. But I remember one morning during the autumn harvest, when every able body in the village was needed, and he knocked on my door before dawn, voice low and careful. "Taeyang," he said, "the yield is heavy this year. I could use you today." I told him my back was troubling me. It was not troubling me. I simply had no intention of spending the day bent over in the mud, returning home with dirt under my nails and chaff in my hair. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then nodded once and left. I listened to his footsteps cross the compound and fade toward the fields, and I turned back to the bronze. There was Elder Sung, whom I passed every morning on the path to the river. He was 80 years old and had known my grandfather. Each morning, he sat outside his door on a low wooden stool, watching the village begin its day, and each morning, he raised his hand in greeting. For a year, I walked past him without stopping, offering at most a glance and a slight nod, the way someone acknowledges furniture they have grown too accustomed to notice properly. My mother saw all of it. She said nothing for a long time, not because she lacked the words, but because she was choosing them carefully, the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. I saw her watching me sometimes, in the space between tasks, her expression carrying something I was too comfortable to identify. It was grief. I know that now. She was watching someone she loved disappear, and the cruelest part was that he was still standing right in front of her. The year I turned 21, my peers began, one by one, to build things. Bolin opened a small medicine stall at the edge of the market, selling dried herbs and remedies his grandmother had taught him. He was there before sunrise every day, arranging his inventory with the careful pride of someone who had worked a long time for a very small table and understood exactly what it represented. The village bought it from him. His mother cried at the opening. By the end of the first season, he had saved enough to repair his family's roof. I watched all of this and felt something I mistook, at the time, for amusement. Bolin, I said to anyone who would listen, spent 3 years learning to sell leaves. His fingers smell like bark, and his future smells worse. I said it lightly, the way people deliver cruelty when they want the pleasure of it without the accountability, as a joke, as an observation, as something that could always be walked back if the room went quiet. The room rarely went quiet. There were always 1 or 2 people willing to laugh, and that was enough to confirm what I already believed, that I was seeing things clearly, and everyone else was simply too polite to agree. Day 1 apprenticed himself to a carpenter in the next village and came home on weekends with sawdust in his hair and a satisfaction on his face that I found genuinely baffling. He married a farmer's daughter that spring, a quiet girl with a wide smile who clearly adored him. Their wedding was simple. The food was plentiful, the music was loud, and everyone there seemed to be having the kind of uncomplicated happiness I had always privately categorized as the consolation prize for people without better options. I attended for exactly 1 hour. On the walk home, I told myself that day one had settled, that a man with patience and sawdust was still just a man with sawdust, that his wife's wide smile would not look the same in 10 years. I said these things quietly, inside my own head, which is where the worst of it lived. Because the words I spoke aloud were damaging enough. The jokes about Boland's table, the raised eyebrow at day one's wedding, the studied indifference I performed whenever someone mentioned a peer's small success. But the interior monologue was the true architecture of my contempt. Every modest life around me became, in my private narration, evidence of limitation. Every humble choice became proof that other men had accepted a story too small for their potential. It never once occurred to me to ask what story I had actually written for myself. The invitations stopped gradually, then completely. I noticed, but told myself I had simply outgrown the need for them. That a man of my particular qualities was not meant for that kind of company. Jimin heard some of what I said around the village. He came to me one evening and sat down across from me without preamble. "There is no mirror in the world," he said quietly, "large enough to show you what you are becoming." I smiled and told him he worried too much. He looked at me for a long moment, then stood and walked back to the fields. He did not bring it up again, and I did not think about it again. Not until much later, when I finally had the kind of eyes that could see what he had meant. The autumn festival was the one night of the year when the village forgot its smallness. Lanterns were strung between every rooftop from the cedar tree to the river's edge, and by dusk the entire valley glowed amber and gold as though the mountains had cupped their hands around us to hold the light in. Drums started before the sun finished setting. The smell of roasting meat and sweet rice wine moved through the air in warm waves, and people who had spent all year with their heads down over their work finally lifted them, looked at each other, and remembered why they lived here. I dressed for 2 hours. My finest robe was deep indigo silk, imported from the coastal market and saved for occasions that matched it. I tied my red headband with the particular precision I reserved for moments when I knew many people would watch me at once. I oiled my hair a second time and checked the bronze mirror at 3 separate angles before stepping outside into the lantern light, where the effect was precisely what I had calculated. Heads turned, conversations paused. A young woman near the drum circle forgot the words she was about to say. I moved through the crowd the way water moves through a space, finding the widest path, taking it without apology, conscious of every eye that followed, and quietly dissatisfied with the ones that didn't. I accepted compliments with the bored grace of someone who had stopped being surprised by them years ago. I was, in every outward sense, the most luminous thing at that festival. I did not see Xing until I had already walked into her. She was moving slowly through the crowd, carrying a clay vessel of rice wine, her back curved with age, her steps careful and deliberate. The collision was mine. I had turned to acknowledge someone calling my name without looking where I was going, but the consequence landed entirely on her. The vessel tilted. The wine came down across the left shoulder of my indigo robe in a dark, spreading stain. The crowd nearest us went quiet. Xing steadied herself, looked at the broken vessel on the ground, then up at me with an expression entirely calm. "My child," she began, her voice carrying the gentleness of someone who had lived long enough to know that accidents are not offenses. "I am so." I did not let her finish. What I said was not loud. That is the thing I cannot excuse by blaming heat or impulse. I looked at her bent back, her worn clothing, her shaking hands, and I spoke quietly, deliberately, with the full weight of someone who has never once considered that words can land like stones. I told her she should know better than to walk into spaces that did not belong to her. The silence that followed was total. Even the drums seemed to hesitate. Xing did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She simply looked at me for a long moment with something in her eyes that was not anger. It was sorrow, deep and patient, the kind that has been waiting for its occasion. And then she raised one hand slowly toward the sky and spoke in a voice I felt more than heard. She said that what I saw in the mirror had served me long enough. Then she lowered her hand, turned, and walked away through the parting crowd, and nobody moved to stop her, and nobody looked at me the way they had looked at me an hour before. I woke before dawn the way I always did, reaching for the bronze mirror before my eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. My fingers found it on the post. I lifted it. I looked. What looked back was not me. The skin was rough, uneven, as though something beneath the surface had shifted in the night and not settled correctly. The sharp lines of my jaw had softened and blurred. My eyes, which I had always known to be my strongest feature, clear, symmetrical, the kind that held attention without effort, were dull. The light behind them flattened to something barely distinguishable from ordinary. My hair, which I had oiled and arranged with such precision the night before, had lost its luster entirely, sitting flat and lifeless against a face I would not have been able to identify in a crowd. I sat completely still for what must have been several minutes. Then I made a sound I had never made before, not a shout, not a word, something that came from a place beneath language, and dropped the mirror. I ran to my mother. Jazan was already awake, sitting by the low fire in the main room with her hands wrapped around a cup of barley tea, and when I came through the doorway, she looked up at my face, and the cup stopped halfway to her lips. She did not scream. She did not look away. She simply lowered the cup slowly to her knee and said my name once, quietly, the way you speak to someone standing at the edge of something dangerous. I told her to tell me it was a trick of the morning light. I told her to tell me it would pass. I stood before her and waited for her to say the thing that would make it untrue. She came to me instead and held my face in both her hands, studying it the way she must have studied it the morning I was born, and her eyes filled with something I could not bear to watch. She said nothing. Her silence was the most honest answer she had ever given me. I went to find Ziying. I went to her house at the edge of the village, where the cedar roots pushed up through the ground, and the door was open, and the hearth was cold, and every surface inside was undisturbed, as though she had left with no urgency and no intention of returning. A neighbor told me she had gone before sunrise. Nobody knew where. Nobody seemed surprised. When I walked back through the village the long way, hoping the early hour would spare me, I understood immediately that it would not. A child near the well stared openly. Two women at the grain store leaned together and whispered without lowering their voices enough. A man I had known my entire life looked at me, then looked away, with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. Not cruelty. Something quieter and more final than cruelty. Indifference. I went home. I hung a cloth over the bronze mirror and sat on the floor beneath it with my back against the wall. And for the first time in my adult life, I had absolutely nothing to do, because the one thing I had spent every morning doing was now something I could not bring myself to face. The village carried on outside without me. It did so, I realized, with a coldness that settled deep in my chest, with very little difficulty at all. He arrived on the third day, when I had eaten almost nothing and spoken to no one. I heard no horse, no cart, no announcement of any kind. Only the sound of a single knock at the door, unhurried, neither soft nor hard, the knock of someone certain they would be answered. I opened the door and found a man I had never seen before standing in the afternoon light, a traveling pack across one shoulder, the particular stillness of someone who had been moving for a very long time and was entirely unbothered by it. He was neither young nor old in any way I could fix precisely. His eyes were the most alert thing about him. "My name is Kyung," he said. "May I sit?" It was not quite a question. I stood aside and let him in. He accepted the tea I made without commenting on its quality, set it down after one sip, and looked at me with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who has no time for the long way around. He told me he knew what had happened. He told me he knew what I had said to Ziying and how I had said it, and that the curse was real and permanent unless I chose otherwise. He said the word "chose" with a specific emphasis, as though he wanted me to understand that what came next was not something being done to me, but something I would have to actively decide, repeatedly, over a long period of time, without guarantee of outcome. The terms, he said, were these. There was a woman in the village named Haru. I knew the name. Everyone knew the name. She lived alone at the northern edge, kept no close company, and had a reputation for being the most exacting, least forgiving, most relentlessly demanding person in the valley. People avoided her work calls. The errands she asked me to do were never done correctly. Her standards were deemed impossible by those who considered themselves capable. I was to enter her household and serve her. Cook, clean, tend the garden, carry water, do whatever she required. Not for wages, not for recognition, not with any expectation that she would notice my effort or acknowledge my presence. I was to serve her the way water serves the ground, completely, invisibly, without requiring thanks. For as long as it took. No fixed term, no milestone, only the work. I asked Kyung how I would know when it was finished. He said I would not know. That was the point. He left before I could ask anything further, and I stood in the doorway watching him disappear down the mountain path. When I turned back inside, Jazin was standing very still by the fire, and her expression told me she had heard everything. Haru arrived the following morning as though the arrangement had already been agreed. She was perhaps 50, lean and straight-backed, with eyes that moved across a room the way a ledger is reviewed. Quickly, completely, missing nothing. She stepped through my doorway, looked at me once from head to foot, and her face arranged itself into the expression of someone who has been handed a tool of uncertain quality and is reserving judgment. She told me to bring my things. She told me I would sleep in the storeroom. She told me breakfast was prepared at sunrise and that she did not repeat instructions. Then she turned and walked back out into the morning, and after a moment I picked up my pack, smaller now than it had ever been, the bronze mirror left hanging on its post, and followed her up the northern path toward whatever came next. It was the most honest thing I had done in years. The storeroom had one window, no mirror, and a sleeping mat thinner than anything I had ever lain on. I was awake before sunrise every morning, not because I had recovered any sense of discipline, but because the cold seeped through the window gap and made sleep impossible after a certain hour. I rose in the dark, built the kitchen fire, and had water boiling before Haru's door opened. This was not praised. It was simply the baseline from which the day's expectations climbed. Her standards operated on a logic I spent the first 2 weeks trying to decode and eventually stopped trying to decode, because I began to understand that the point was not the standard itself, but what meeting it required of me. The soup was too thin, then too thick, then too thin again. The garden rows were straight, but not straight enough. The firewood was stacked incorrectly. Not dangerously, not impractically, simply not the way she wanted it. She wanted it a specific way, and I was to learn that way without being shown it more than once. She moved through my efforts each day like a woman reading a document for errors, and her corrections were delivered without cruelty and without warmth, which was somehow more demanding than either. I said nothing. This was new for me. The old Taeyang would have defended himself, explained himself, and found some way to redirect the conversation toward his own dignity. But I had arrived with no dignity left to protect, and that absence, I slowly discovered, was not only a loss. It was also a kind of freedom. When there is nothing left to preserve, you can do the work. My hands changed first. The softness left them by the end of the 3rd week, replaced by something tougher and more honest. I noticed it one morning while kneading dough and felt, unexpectedly, something close to satisfaction, not pride, which I knew the texture of well, but something quieter. The simple recognition that my body had learned something real. One afternoon on the path to the lower market, I passed a young boy struggling to carry a bundle of wood twice his size, listing sideways with every step. I stopped without thinking, took half the bundle from him, walked him to his family's gate, and left without waiting to be thanked. I was halfway back up the path before I realized I had done it, that it had not been calculated or performed, that no one whose opinion I valued was watching, that it had simply been the obvious thing to do, and I had done it. I passed Elder Sung's house the following morning and bowed before I knew I was going to. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he returned the bow with a gravity that made something shift quietly in my chest. A week later, I found my childhood friend Rio mending a fence alone in the south field. The same Rio I had mocked publicly 2 years before for apprenticing with a carpenter rather than waiting for something grander. I stopped. I told him I had been wrong to say what I had said, and I was sorry. He looked at me the way people look at unexpected weather, uncertain how to receive it. Then he nodded once and handed me a spare post to hold. We worked in silence for an hour. It was one of the better hours I had spent in recent memory. I did not see Zing during any of this. But once, descending the mountain path at dusk with empty water vessels, I had the distinct sensation of being watched from the tree line, not with menace, but with the patient attention of someone keeping a record. I kept walking. I kept working. I stopped checking for results. I do not know what made that particular night different from the ones before it. Haru had gone to bed early. The house was quiet in the specific way mountain houses become quiet after dark. Total, thick, the kind of silence that presses gently against the ears. And I sat in the kitchen with the last of the evening's candle burning low on the table beside a piece of paper I had taken from the supply shelf weeks ago, without knowing why I was taking it. I had not written anything in years. There had never seemed to be anything worth recording. I sat for a long time without touching the paper. The candle moved in some draft I couldn't locate. Outside, the mountains were invisible against the sky, which was the same darkness but with stars in it, and I looked at that for a while, too. Then I picked up the brush, and I wrote. I did not write to Zing. I had tried that in my mind many times during the early weeks. Composing explanations, apologies calibrated for maximum effect, arguments for why the punishment exceeded the offense, and I had eventually recognized all of it for what it was, negotiation. The same instinct that had always served me, the instinct to manage how I was perceived, was wearing the costume of remorse. I was done with that. I did not write about my face. I had not thought about my face in several days, which itself felt like information worth noting. I wrote about a man, not who I had been, not even who I was now exactly, the man I intended to be when I left this house. However, that leaving eventually came, on whatever terms, with or without the face I was born with. I wrote that he rose early not to tend a mirror, but because the morning had work in it, and work was no longer something he avoided. I wrote that he listened to people when they spoke, fully, without planning his response while their mouths were still moving. I wrote that he kept no account of his own generosity, that he did not give to receive the particular warmth of being seen giving. I wrote that he remembered Sung's bow and understood it as the most instructive moment of his education. I wrote that he carried his father's patience the way Jimin had always carried it, quietly, completely, as though it were simply the correct way to move through the world. I wrote for a long time. The candle burned out while I was still writing, and I kept writing in the dark until I could no longer see the page. Then, I sat with my hands flat on the paper and listened to the silence. I slept where I was, my head on my folded arms at the kitchen table. And in that sleep, Zing came. She was luminous in the way certain things are luminous in dreams. Not lit from outside, but generating their own light, warm and sourceless. She looked the way she had looked at the festival before I spoke, before everything shifted. Calm, unhurried, carrying the patience of someone for whom time moves differently. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she glanced at the paper beneath my hands and back at my face, and something in her expression settled into certainty. The letter is already true, she said. Her voice was the same voice that had cursed me, but it carried something entirely different now. Not sorrow, not judgment, simply recognition. You wrote it with your hands long before you wrote it with ink. She did not wait for my response. She did not need to. The light she carried moved outward slowly, filling the edges of the dream, and I felt something in my chest, something that had been braced for a long time, the way a person holds their shoulders when they are expecting impact. Quietly, finally, let go. I woke with my cheeks still against the paper and the kitchen full of early light. For a moment I lay there, watching the light move across the floor the way it did every morning, and I felt the particular stillness that follows a sleep, so complete it leaves no residue of dreams, only the clean, quiet fact of being awake. Then I remembered, not with urgency, not with the desperate lurch I had felt on so many previous mornings, but slowly, the way you remember something important that has already been resolved. I sat up and looked at my reflection in the dark surface of the water vessel beside the table. My face had returned. I sat with that for a long moment. The sharpness was back, the jaw, the symmetry, the eyes I had once spent hours cultivating an awareness of. All of it present, all of it mine. But I looked at it the way you look at a tool you know how to use now, having spent a long time learning what it is actually for. It was my face. It was not my identity. The distinction felt so clear and so obvious that I could not entirely believe it had once escaped me. I found Haru in the garden before breakfast, doing what she always did, moving through the rows with her sharp, assessing attention, cataloging what needed doing. I stood at the garden's edge and waited until she looked up. When she did, she studied my face for a moment without expression, the way she studied everything, extracting the necessary information and filing it away. I bowed, low, formal, the full depth that the village reserved for its most significant debts. I told her I was grateful, not for lifting the curse. She had not lifted it, and we both understood that. I told her I was grateful for the impossibility of her standards, for the silence of her acknowledgement, for the education that had lived inside the repetition of ordinary work. I had brought her a gift, a bolt of good silk from the market, understated, precisely her quality, and I placed it at the garden's edge without making more of the gesture than it was. She looked at the silk. She looked at me. She made a sound that was almost nothing, picked up the silk without ceremony, and went back to her garden. It was the warmest response she had ever given me. I understood it completely. Yoon found me 3 days later on the road between my village and the valley market. He was not what I expected, not loud, not performative, carrying none of the signals I had once associated with wealth and importance. He was simply a man who paid close attention, and when he spoke, it was clear he had been paying it for some time. He told me he had been watching. Not my face, he said this directly, without apology, but my hands, my habits, the quality of my presence in ordinary moments. He had a business that needed a partner with the rarest combination he knew, a face that opened rooms and a character that justified staying in them. He had been waiting, he said, for the character to arrive. What we built together over the following years, I could spend a long time describing. The early offices, the first expansion, the morning we signed the agreement, the number in our accounts was larger than either of us had imagined when we began. But the architecture of success is less interesting than the foundation beneath it, and the foundation was simply this. I worked. I listened. I treated every person in every room as though their interior life was as real and as worthy as mine. Which, of course, it was. I had needed to be emptied before I could understand that. I returned to the village on a Tuesday in late autumn, 17 years after the morning I woke up a stranger to my own reflection. I funded the school that the village had been trying to build for a decade. I sat with the elders at the cedar tree and listened more than I spoke. I visited my father's grave and stayed there long enough to say the things I had never said when he was alive to hear them. I found Richard, who now ran the finest carpentry workshop in the valley, and I commissioned him to build the shelving for our new regional office. I paid him what he asked without negotiating, and I told him why. My penthouse office in the city has one wall that is mostly glass, overlooking a skyline that still occasionally surprises me with its scale. On the opposite wall, between two significant pieces of art that my assistant chose and I approved without much objection, there hangs a bronze circle the size of 2 open palms. It is cracked across the lower left quarter. The crack happened the morning I dropped it, the morning I could not recognize myself, the morning everything I had built on the wrong foundation came apart in the dark before sunrise. I have been offered replacements. I have been told it looks out of place among the other things on that wall, which are valuable and whole. I tell people it is the most valuable thing in the room. They assume I mean financially. I have stopped explaining that I do not. Comment below if you learned any lessons in this story. Smash that like button and subscribe to K-Mafia Story HQ for more stories. See you in the next one.